Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic. My name is Brianna Griffith. We're going to start the show today with our regular monthly segment. This is Latin America in Focus with Luis Francisco Rangel, where we talk about the latest political developments throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you, Luis, for coming back on.
Thanks for having me.
So we have three different articles we're going to be looking at today, some of which essentially cover, the different kind of political and military turmoil throughout South America. And one of which deals with basically the Venezuelan opposition. We're covering a lot of ground today, but I'd like to start with an article from Orinoco Tribune. This is titled "Colombia's Defense Minister Defends the Operation in Which 7 Children Died." So I'm wondering if you can give us the rundown on what exactly has happened here. So
in Colombia, the president, Duque, and the Minister of Defense had an attack on a group called FARC, which they describe as dissidents, rebels. It's a paramilitary group that was formed quite some time ago. It's been demobilized for quite a while at this point, but they took it upon themselves to mount an attack on one of their bases, which killed, I think, around 20 people, and several of them were children.
Yeah, 7 children died. A 12-year-old girl was among that. And, this really goes to show to me that the Colombian government was never really in a good operating in good faith when it came to the sort of peace agreement that was signed a couple years back regarding the FARC. So one of the things I think the FARC agreed to do was essentially demobilize from kind of their long fight, their long guerrilla warfare, essentially, in the belief that essentially it was unwinnable, but also in the belief that the Colombian government to some degree would operate in good faith. What we've seen here is that that's not true. And what we don't often hear, I think, about the level of violence coming from Colombia. The fact that of the human rights defenders who were killed in the world last year, something like a third of them were killed in Colombia. So Colombia being responsible for 1/3 of all of the human rights deaths in the world, due essentially largely to this sort of long standing, basically like the coordination, not just the kind of violence that we see here, for instance, from the Colombian military itself, but also the coordination between the Colombian government and these far right-wing paramilitaries. I mean, essentially, it's been a long orchestrated terrorist campaign against the FARC, against civilians. It's generated a lot of what we call or what are called falsos positivos, that's false positives. That is to say, where the Colombian government will basically like launch one of these strikes, kill a bunch of people, and then just declare them all to be enemy combatants and not recognize when they've, for instance, killed civilians and whatnot. It's really a horrifying situation, and I think it shows to some degree, it shows why many sort of leftist or even social democratic groups such as the Sandinistas or other groups like that, it shows why they, I think, mobilized in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, when you have this kind of normalized aggression and just over-the-top aggression, there's no other choice but to arm yourselves and militarize yourself to an extent, so that just for basic self-defense, basic survival at that point. The situation in Colombia is extremely aggressive, even for far-right groups. I think I read that somewhere that this year, 2020, 14 social humanitarian leaders have already been killed in Colombia.
Yeah.
That's more than one per day.
Yeah. I didn't even think about that. That is more than one per day.
Yeah.
It's been a vicious assault against indigenous groups. It's been a vicious assault against trade unions. Colombia is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a trade unionist, for instance. And it all ultimately comes down to Colombia in some ways being the sort of narco state that the Colombian government, especially like Ivan Duque, who has ties to the previous Uribe administration, and whatnot. I mean, Duque is always projecting this narco state slander onto everybody, including onto the children that he's just bombed, including onto like the Venezuelan government, which, if you know anything about Latin America, Venezuela really doesn't have the problem with, for instance, the cocaine cultivation and whatnot that Colombia has historically had. I mean, it's essentially its projection by Duque of the country's own problems onto other countries and onto the civilian populations that are so terrorized, I think, by this government.
Yes, and this is a typical tactic of a fascist government, where they try to paint narratives where other people and other organizations and essentially just working class communities is what it comes down to, are the ones who are doing all the things wrong that they are actually culpable of.
Did you see the video by chance? It's a little bit random, but when there were in the early stages of the major protests in Chile, somebody managed to get a video of one of the Chilean carabineros, just snorting coke before he was about to go out and police brutalize somebody. I
didn't see that video, but that is par for the course.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. That is definitely a tactic, I think, of different fascist regimes, is that sort of projection of, against the moral depravity and whatnot, this projection of moral depravity onto your enemies while often engaging. And usually I think fascists have a more predilection for uppers generally. If you look at what Hitler was on in his last days and whatnot, or generally like all the kind of coke problems that Bolsonaro has had as well, the different the very credible allegations have been made against him. But yeah, anyway, pretty horrifying stuff going down in Colombia. Different human rights organizations are speaking out against that. Let's turn to the next story. This is from Reuters, covered in plenty of other outlets as well. Titled "Bolivia exiled ex-president Morales calls on radio for armed militias." It's a pretty inflammatory, I think, title. Obviously, Reuters being a British outlet, they have their own kind of agenda on that, as does any journalistic outlet. But yeah, basically, what is this story about?
So Morales has called on people to come together and arm themselves again in these community groups, so as to defend themselves at a basic level, is a basic self-defense, similar to any other sort of leftist organization that arms themselves, like the FARC, and mobilizes. In this case, he specifically called for arming themselves not with guns, but with slingshots. So again, this is not some sort of aggression against any particular group. This is self-defense. This is something that people need when governments are actively attacking them and brutalizing their communities and killing their community members.
Yeah, and the other part of this is that really the hostile fascist coup, the white supremacist coup that took over Bolivia late last year, never really fully consolidated itself. And I want to point specifically to the work of Ali Vargas, who is a journalist inside Bolivia. Now, first of all, it's very, very dangerous to be a journalist inside Bolivia right now. Because of journalists, as well as different members of MAS are being targeted. Union leaders are being targeted. There's been a lot of violence, a lot of killings within Bolivia. But Ali Vargas has reported from Bolivia in, for instance, the Gray Zone. There's an article that we don't have time to get into, titled "Bolivia's Free Territory of Chapare has ousted the coup regime and is bracing for a bloody reinvasion." So the coup regime, even this many months later, has been unable to really consolidate fully its power in Bolivia. So there's a lot of there's a lot of kind of unknowns here. There's a lot of really people's resistance that I think has led to the coup essentially faltering in many ways. And I think this was best illustrated when Janine Áñez had to declare herself president in front of a mostly empty Senate. They couldn't even basically find any senators who were willing or able to come in to sort of provide for this coronation. But yeah, I think it goes again to show like why these groups mobilize in the first place, which is because, essentially these groups are being attacked because indigenous people in Bolivia are under attack. And I think the sort of proof in the pudding as to like how to avoid this kind of coup really, I think, goes to, again, Venezuela. When, for instance, John Bolton was doing some sort of press conference on Venezuela a while back. This is at the kind of height of Juan Guaido's attempt to seize power. He sort of let slip, if you'll remember, the Notebook. Do you remember the Notebook kind of thing?
I do. Yeah, I do regularly remember that.
Yeah, where he had said something like 5,000 troops, or he had written on the Notebook 5,000 troops to Colombia or something to that effect. And it was supposed to be like a slip, like he accidentally wrote it and it was accidentally filmed, but it was clearly supposed to be a threat. So I believe it was the foreign minister, Jorge Arreaza of Venezuela, who, did the same thing. He was holding a press conference, and on his notebook, he just had a single line written that said 3 million militia members defend or something like that.
Oh, oops.
And that's what Venezuela has done. Like Venezuela recognizing sort of this tension here, the PSUV and other kind of forces in the Patriotic Front. I forget exactly the Great Patriotic Pole, rather. These forces have aligned to essentially begin to mobilize these people's militias, not military per se, but basically like people's self-defense forces in case there were sort of coup as it happened in Bolivia. If you'll remember that the military and the police took to the streets and were brutally suppressing people, were killing people. And so when you put that kind of power within the hands of working people, within the hands of indigenous groups themselves, you to some degree are able, I think, to neutralize that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Morales even said that it would be too trusting of governments to not do that. As we saw with what happened in Colombia, the FARC demobilized, and they're still bombing them, they're still killing them. So at this point, it's just a matter of whether or not you want to defend yourself, you want to live. And if the government forces are going to be going out on the streets, regardless of anything that happens, regardless of whether or not you're armed, regardless of whether or not you're out doing things, they're still just going to come and shoot you. It makes perfect sense to arm yourself with things that you can use.
Yeah, that's been sort of a criticism of some, some groups kind of on the farther left. I hate to say the far left per se, but some groups on the farther left have at various points kind of criticized MAS and these other forces. That's a movement for socialism in Bolivia, and these other sort of pink tide governments that started emerging in the 2000s for not having that sort of that militant component that would allow them to survive these coup attempts or whatnot. I'm not really going to weigh in on that because I feel like that tends to be sort of Sunday morning or was it Monday morning quarterbacking or whatnot, however that goes. It tends to be sort of like backseat driving when you criticize movements where you don't really know the full impact of what it is they're planning for. But it does seem like there's a shift in MAS, in the kind of leadership there toward, a more militant style of resistance that takes into account, the fact that there was this coup and whatnot. So we have a couple minutes left. I'd love to talk about everybody's favorite character here. Truly the Pete Buttigieg of Venezuela. Juan Guaido made the news again. Let's go through this Gray Zone article titled "This Might Be the Final Episode of Juan Guaido's Surreal Venezuela Regime Change Reality Show."
It really is a reality show because, excluding all the terrible things that are implicated in all this, reading about it is just hilarious. This guy is just he's a nonstop machine of farcical entertainment.
Yeah, and basically what happened here with Juan Guaido was that after having essentially been voted out by kind of a fractured opposition, even some of the right-wing Venezuelan opposition has now found themselves essentially siding with the PSUV because they realize that Guaido himself is a dead end. He attempted a coup. I believe it was 5 times in 2019. There were 5 different coup attempts where he attempted to he and his supporters either attempted to storm a military building or create a walkout or whatnot, each time more farcical than the last. And so now basically we saw this video again. This is This is as of January 8th when this was published. We saw this wonderful video of him trying to jump a fence into the National Assembly, where he's essentially being booted out. The National Assembly, by the way, doesn't even really hold any power at this point because it's been declared in contempt of the Venezuelan government because it attempted to seat corrupt officials who had engaged essentially in vote tampering and whatnot. So like the fact that he's not even able to vie for power, the fact that he's essentially impotent within a system that holds no power whatsoever, I think really speaks volumes. Like this was a failed effort.
And this is part of the hilarity of it all because, the real legislative body in Venezuela is the Constituent Assembly, which was formed by Maduro. The National Assembly is really just, it's still in place for symbolic reasons, I suppose. But it holds no real power. And Juan Guaido was a member of the National Assembly. The National Assembly is composed of opposition organizations, but these opposition organizations are constantly at odds with each other. There are more moderate parties within the opposition and more extreme far right. Juan Guaido belongs to one of the more far right organizations. And as you said, the moderates have been trying to make efforts to consolidate a bit of the balance of power with the Maduro administration, which is a good call because the Venezuelan economy had been at a sort of a gridlock there for a while. But now that they're working together a bit more, the Venezuelan economy is slowly going forward for that and for many other reasons. But the far right wings of the opposition don't want any of this. And Juan Guaido in particular really can't handle it because when he failed to break into the National Assembly for some reason, he tried again to get into the National Assembly by not jumping a fence, which is probably a good call there. But he couldn't get in this time because he refused to be allowed in if he could not bring 11 former members of the legislature that are also leaders in the most far right-wing organizations within the opposition. The people that there were perfectly fine with him going in, but he refused to go in if these other people couldn't go in. And then he used that as a way to demonize Maduro supporters into saying that he's not allowed to go in. Again, not true. And then after he failed to go into the National Assembly, he went over to a newspaper publication center and with former members of the National Assembly, former leaders, tried to establish himself as leader of a parallel National Assembly, a parallel to a government body that already doesn't have any power.
So Juan Guaido is already the president, right? He's quote unquote he's the president of Venezuela.
You know what's really funny about this is that Mike Pence tweeted that he is in support of Juan Guaido and basically, I think, copied and pasted his speech, his quote unquote speech. It only took like 30 seconds. But what his response was when Juan Guaido initially declared himself the interim president back in February 2019, he tweeted that once again when Juan Guaido tried to make another government body that has somehow even less power.
Yeah, nothing says presidential like failing to enter into your own parliamentary body and being voted out of it by opposition leaders, mind you, not by Maduro supporters, but by opposition leaders, by getting voted out of that and then going and saying, I'm going to create my own government now. I mean, it's farcical. The danger continues to be there for Venezuela because Juan Guaido has, as impotent as he absolutely is, as powerless as he absolutely is, he still is now attempting, for instance, to take over the airwaves of Telesur. That would be a huge, it would be a huge blow to just journalism and free speech generally. Whatever one might think of Telesur, I think it's generally a pretty reliable source. I think there's a lot there, but regardless of what one thinks of Telesur, for this far right wing self-declared president to attempt to take over the airways of Telesur and just say this is my airways, I'm going to reclaim it, it's mine, and no one else can use it, and essentially shut down this major source of information that's countering the other essentially corporate media in Latin America, that would be a huge blow. It remains to be seen whether he has any power to actually do that. That's simply the claim he's trying to make. But yeah, it's certainly, I mean, he's spent as a force. The funny thing is he's not the first spent force. If you look at Venezuela, parts of the Venezuelan ruling class are actually littered with these spent forces, such as Leopoldo Lopez and other kind of plotters of different coup attempts that go all the way back to the 2002 coup attempt. And you know, for all the talk we always hear about Venezuela being this quote unquote authoritarian nightmare, the fact that the PSUV simply allows these people who plotted coups against the government to mostly live within the country and do their own thing. The fact that these people,
Leopoldo was on house arrest.
Yeah,
they didn't even put him in prison.
Yeah, Leopoldo Lopez was, again, also part of that Popular Will Party. This is the party that's essentially incited violence and led to lynchings against Afro-Venezuelans in the streets. Orlando Figueroa, for instance, was lynched in 2017. A group of, anti-Chavistas, a group of essentially like the revolting Venezuelan ruling class, surrounded Orlando Figueroa, burned him alive in the streets, and said in Spanish, they essentially said, "See, black man, this is what happens to Chavistas," as he burned to death in the streets. And so that's when we're talking about Leopoldo Lopez, when we're talking about Juan Guaido, that's the party that they lead. They're the party that's responsible largely for that major street violence in 2014, 2017, within a very fractured Venezuelan opposition. So like again, Leopoldo Lopez, for all of his incitement to violence over years and years and years, was on enough of a house arrest that Juan Guaido, at the height of his coup, at the height of his liberation of Venezuela, marched over and live streamed himself liberating Leopoldo Lopez. And essentially it was him and like 5 people just went and took him from the house where he was just kind of chilling out. It's
his really nice giant house.
Yeah. Because again, these are the ruling class, the former ruling class of Venezuela, largely vying for whatever table scraps they can get. They are largely spent as a force. As it is, they're not coming back to power, barring basically an external invasion at this point. The Venezuelan government has provided essentially too much economic support to the people, I think, and the opposition is so fractured that I don't think they really have anything to offer.
No, not at all. I mean, especially because the more moderate wings of the opposition are trying to work with the Maduro government actively, and with Maduro supporters and the supporters that wing of the opposition has taken with them, they say the far right wing members of the opposition simply don't have the voters to make any sort of have any sort of impact at this point.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me in some ways like of the kind of nobility as they found. This is really tangential, but of sort of like the European nobility when all of a sudden sort of capitalism superseded feudalism, and so they found themselves essentially being in some ways sort of paid off. I mean, you can look at sort of the royal family of England today, where it's like they were sort of paid off in this ceremonial role, but they never they will never again sort of wield political power. And so like essentially you see this now that there are no sort of political stakes for the Venezuelan ruling class, now that essentially they are spent as a political force, again, at least for the foreseeable future, like this sort of flailing and this sort of jockeying for like this power within this symbolic power within Venezuela as part of the National Assembly or whatnot. It really seems in many ways like that, this like sort of this former ruling class trying to vie for a spot in society that somehow still puts them above the people, but I don't think they're going to get it.
No, absolutely not.
All right. So yeah, I think that's a great place to end it on. We were joined for this segment by Luis Francisco Rangel, who is a cultural worker, a musician of Venezuelan heritage. Thank you very much, Luis, for coming on the show once again.
Thanks for having me.
And so now we're going to continue talking about the kind of situation with regard to the escalation between the U.S. and Iran, the essentially U.S. aggression is the best kind of way to put that. I'd like to this week focus on kind of veterans resistance from kind of both from within and from without, to essentially these wars. There's always in the build up to whether it's a war on Iran, war on Iraq, or in Afghanistan, Vietnam, you can go all the way back and essentially see that there's this kind of a need to push things into this kind of rigid formula, this rigid support for the war. But in fact, these wars have been even unpopular even amongst many of the people fighting them. So I'd like to generally talk about sort of the resistance to war generally from within both groups within the military and veterans groups. So to talk about all this, we are joined by Mike Prysner, who's the co-host of the I Left podcast, along with Spencer Rapone. Thank you very much, Mike, for returning to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I should also just mention that you're a producer of the Empire Files with Abby Martin as well.
That's right.
Yeah. Excellent work there for sure.
Thank you.
There's been this kind of a mythology that we haven't heard, or that we've heard a lot about, that, essentially the way to support the troops is to essentially support the wars. This really dates back in many ways to the kind of right-wing shift that the country took under the Bush administration during the so-called War on Terror. But it seems that the reality is that many of the veterans themselves, in fact, more of the veterans as a percentage of the population, more veterans actually oppose these wars than the U.S. population at large. Can you talk about how that kind of unfolded in your own experiences as well?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, first of all, the history of resistance from within the armies of imperialist countries is something that goes as far back as the existence of imperialism and imperialist countries. I mean, it really is just such a really rich and interesting history that spans all of the imperialist nations. And so, really World War I was the first kind of mass, large-scale mutinies and rebellions and revolutions by not just draftees, but, people who joined the military to fight in World War I and all of that stuff. And so you can really look at any imperialist country, and you have these kind of really interesting stories from Russia to Portugal to Italy. I mean, and then of course applies to the United States. And so the history, if you're looking just at the United States, of resistance and mutiny and rebellion from within the military, it goes, it spans pretty much every single war that the U.S. has fought in, from the U.S. war on the Philippines, even to World War II, which, many people wouldn't expect being the, heroic fight against the Nazis. I mean, you even have large scale mutinies, particularly by African-American soldiers, like strikes, like, for example, the Port Chicago mutiny, where hundreds of African-American sailors refused to load munitions on ships in protest of unsafe working conditions and things like that. And so the history is extremely cool. I encourage everyone to check it out. Definitely beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, all the different kind of really interesting stories there. But I think the kind of best example of, radical organizing against war from within the military is during the Vietnam War, when really tens of thousands of active duty service members had not just become against the Vietnam War, but were active participants in the anti-war movement from within the ranks of the military, which included both actions back here in the United States, mutinies on their bases, refusing to deploy, sabotaging equipment and stuff, but also included people on the front lines engaging in large-scale acts of resistance, like entire infantry companies sitting down on the battlefield, refusing to go on patrols, blowing up their radios so they couldn't do missions, even killing their own officers, which became a rising cause of death for the most gung-ho officers in Vietnam. And so it really impeded the U.S. war effort. And so that's kind of an example of what the levels that it can actually reach. But I think there's a misconception that ended when the draft ended, and that the large-scale resistance in the military through U.S. history, and in particular in Vietnam, it's just because there is a draft and there's people in the military who are forced to be in the military and so forth. And so that myth has been busted, by the experience of organizing in the military ever since the draft ended. And even after the draft, you can see in every and of course, in the Vietnam War, the anti-war resistance included many soldiers who enlisted to go to Vietnam, or who had enlisted prior to the Vietnam War, not just draftees, who learned through their own experiences which side they were on. But even since then, I mean, every war there's been resistance from within the military. I think that the situation we're in today with Trump's actions, the composition of the military kind of resembles what it was when the Gulf War started. I was of the generation that joined right before 9/11. So like 9/11 happened when I was still in training. And so I'm from this kind of, people joining for college money, never expect to have to go to war. There was like a phase where it was a lot of people joining with the intention of going to war to get revenge for 9/11 and all of that stuff. But even those people became the most militant anti-war activists and war resistors who refused to go on repeated deployments and so forth. But I think today, with the wars having wound down, the student loan debt crisis, which is huge. In fact, the Army just broke its record for recruitment and specifically cited the student loan debt crisis for why they were able to recruit so many new young soldiers with student debt. But the military kind of resembles what it did when the Gulf War was starting, which is people who don't expect to go to war and are joining because of a financial hardship. Now, when the Gulf War started, immediately, the GI Bill had just come into effect. People didn't think that they would ever go to war. When the Gulf War started, like 2,500 soldiers immediately applied for conscientious objection status, which would exempt them from deployment. Those who got denied, like a few hundred of them actually went to jail instead of going to the Gulf War. Many of them, about 20 soldiers like refused publicly and did like press conferences. One, guy, Jeff Patterson, actually sat down on the tarmac when they were being loaded on the plane to go to Kuwait, and was hauled off in cuffs, and that many soldiers actually did that, actually sat down when they were like one step away from getting on the plane to being deployed. But there was even more large scale mutinies at that time. There was one National Guard unit at Fort Hood, Texas, that like over 100 of them like organized a mass desertion where like they all just left the base together to refuse to go to the war. And so I think if we kind of take those little lessons of like the potential, I mean, those prove without a doubt that these things are possible when a war crisis is breaking out. And that if people who are interested in political organizing and anti-war agitation and so forth, it shows that if you can be effective and strategic with your anti-war organizing and agitation targeting people in the military, it just shows that there's a base of people that are ready and willing to hear these things and actually maybe even take a step to becoming active participants in the war resistance. And so with this recent danger of going to war with Iran, I mean, I saw that to a really large degree. Now, I used to be involved in actually during the Afghanistan war surge, me and other veterans, we would go to military bases where units were deploying to Afghanistan, and we would get on the base with the help of other anti-war soldiers. And we would distribute leaflets and all this stuff telling service members that they don't have to go to Afghanistan. And if they wanted to refuse to go, we would provide the services to help them refuse. Now, this is when the casualties were at an all-time high. The biggest casualty was wounds to your genitalia. So it was like pretty scary to know that you'd have to go to Afghanistan, which no one knew why they were going anyway. And even at the height of that, every base we would go to, we'd pick up a couple war resistors who would say, yeah, I don't want to go. And they'd file conscientious objection or use some other way to get out. And we would help them through that process. But the response that we got when this thing with Iran started, it was far more than the response I'd ever seen in that kind of past generation. Really dozens and dozens of people were reaching out to us, active duty people who are saying, I am not going to participate in any type of war operation against Iran, and I need to start exploring my options to do that. And so I'm actually in the process now of working with a good handful of active duty people who are putting in their conscientious objection packets and other kind of ways they're able to, use your rights in the military to get out of doing this kind of thing.
Those people who are kind of my age, those who are kind of entering their 30s now, like for us, for people our age, like we think of the military as being sort of those gung ho people, the post 9/11 people,
right.
who signed up, very much. I mean, not all of them, but very much were either looking for revenge after 9/11 because they were sold this false bill of goods as to who was responsible, or they were otherwise just racist or otherwise just looking, adventurous. They were looking for battle. They were looking for destruction. Right. They want to cause it. But I think what you're saying here, at least from what I'm hearing, is that there's a very kind of different reality now that, now that essentially this global war on terror has kind of entered a new phase where the U.S. essentially has lost in all these countries. The U.S., as the Afghanistan papers just revealed, the U.S. military was lying, and top civilian officials were lying about how the U.S. was doing in Afghanistan. That's not to say it would have been a just war if the U.S. had been doing quote unquote really well, but nonetheless, like we're seeing this sort of false bill of goods unfold. But at the same time, because there's been kind of less kind of explosive resistance to these wars, and the wars have not been as intensified as they were a few years back. Again, we're seeing, I think, a real economic draft where people who are pretty young are signing up because that's the only way to get out of these impoverishment conditions. So, I think it's important for us to not think of the military as simply some sort of monolith of people who all think this way, people all think that way, people who come from one class or another class, but understand that there is that segment of people who, for various reasons, do very much oppose this war. Whatever the reason they might be in the military, they don't want to be fighting these wars. They understand that these wars are not only unwinnable, but also unjust. And so, yeah, I think, the project you've had with Eyes Left, trying to kind of provide an educational outlet and trying to reach out to people, I think is a really, really interesting step that, I think is to some degree unique within the United States right now. I don't know of a lot of other groups that are doing that.
Yeah, it's interesting because the time where the Army broke records for not being able to recruit people, when Army recruitment was like at an all-time low for like its entire history, was during the worst years of the Iraq War. And so that just kind of, and that now that it's, they're at the highest levels because people don't think they're going to have to go to war and there's a economic student debt crisis. I mean, that just kind of speaks to it, that the majority of people don't want to do that kind of thing and are just joining as some kind of means to an end. And in fact, it's also important to point out that most people who join the military join to just serve out a short contract. It's not like they're going in as careerists. They're like, oh, I just got to do 3 years and then I'll get some college money and it can pay off some of this debt and, be able to have healthcare for the first couple of years of my kid's life or something like that. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely, the generation has changed. But you're right. There is a sector of people who join to go shoot someone. And that's definitely exists. I think it's more of a minority. In fact, like 80% or more of jobs in the military are non-combat jobs. They don't end up being non-combat when you get deployed, which is something that I learned. I was in a non-combat job and ended up doing, convoy security and all the types of things that, only combat arms were supposed to be doing. But, most people join in kind of these benign, like, oh, I'm an X-ray technician and things like that, they think they can use as skills when they get out. But of course, there is a sector of people who join because they are either racist, they want to shoot people, they have sociopathic tendencies, or they've kind of like bought into this hero fantasy, which we're so supremely indoctrinated with. I mean, when you really start, if you really pay attention to everything you see on television and advertising and movies, it's all just this like glorification of the warrior, which is like a guy who has a cool gun and is like shooting a bunch of people. And so a lot of, given that you kind of can join the military at age 17, like I was in Iraq with a guy who was 17. He hadn't turned 18 yet. And in the fact that the recruiting process starts when you're much younger than 17, like when you're like 13 in some states, you can see why some people get wrapped up into this kind of thing. But that's not to say that those people can't be reached also. In fact, I would say like some of the most dedicated anti-war veterans that I know who have been the most longtime dedicated principled activists in the veterans anti-war struggle were people like that who joined after 9/11, joined in a combat arms job, joined to go to war and get revenge and all of this stuff, and then ended up being horrified by what they had become, what they were a part of, and taking the side of the Iraqi and Afghan people. And so I think that even those extreme cases, which don't represent the most of people in the military, they can also be reached. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there's actually kind of a more unique and advantageous position now for reaching people in the military, because not only, as we were saying, that it's, people who are predominantly joining now to find some kind of future or way out of their bad situation, which, young people don't see much of a future in this country anymore. But I think another thing is just this different political climate that we're in. As you mentioned, like people our age, like we have grown up with the U.S. at war, like for all of it. And especially people who are like, in their 18, 19, 20, early 20s, like they've grown up with the U.S. at war in Iraq, at war in Afghanistan their entire life. And they don't see any purpose for it. And they see it as kind of dumb. And I think one of the interesting components of that, too, is not only do you have that, the lack of seeing a future, the experience of seeing these kind of endless, pointless wars that the U.S. is in. But, young people today have just more political consciousness. And one of the interesting statistics I saw with the relation to the presidential campaign is that Bernie Sanders for as whatever critiques we have of his foreign policy, of which there's a lot, especially in his history, that someone who is an avowed who identifies as a socialist and who identifies as the strongest anti-war candidate who wants to end the war on terror and all of these things, he has more donations from active duty service members than not just Trump, who you would think has the most, but Trump and the next three top people combined, Trump,
wow.
Buttigieg. Yeah, I mean, so Bernie's support in the military is massive, and he has almost 3 or 4 times more the number of donations than Trump does in the military. And so if you just think about that, how many people in the military consider themselves Bernie Sanders socialists, then you see that they're really not that big of a step away from becoming anti-imperialists like we are.
One of the reasons, for instance, I always kind of push a lot of the Bernie Sanders lines on, for instance, Medicare for all or whatnot, because obviously I understand, for instance, that the U.S. imperial state is in many ways incompatible with a quote unquote liberal social democracy. One or the other has to give, and the U.S. empire always wins out within that, and so that's why we have no even the mildest social democratic safety nets. But I think that revelation, even among someone who like Bernie Sanders, who has a very checkered history, who has voted for a lot of these authorizations of military force and whatnot, even he, in sort of pushing for this social safety net, reveals the contradictions, because he's always asked, for instance, how are you going to pay for Medicare for all? And of course, nobody's ever asked, how are you going to pay for the military, which the Democrats just, basically gave Trump everything he wanted with regard to military. They gave him $730 billion for military funding, more than the Pentagon asked for. They gave him his Space Force with getting nothing basically in return. And then they reauthorized the Patriot Act. So they gave him unlimited powers for spying. And then at the same time, they also invited him back. This is while they're impeaching him, but they invited him. Nancy Pelosi extended the invitation for him to do the State of the Union while she was impeaching him. Yeah. So it's even someone like Bernie Sanders seems like such a, for whatever problems I have of him, I voice my criticisms often, seems like such a breath of fresh air, and this sort of push toward basic social safety nets, that hypocrisy there between not being able to get even a basic national healthcare system while we're spending these trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars on these endless wars abroad, I think just reveals the contradiction within that system.
Yeah, I think that the majority of service members are not they don't follow. I was someone who really followed politics when I was in the military, and most people do not do that in my experience, at least when I was in. But they are political in the sense that they understand class, and I think that's best reflected by the kind of relationship between enlisted soldiers and the officers. Every enlisted soldier you will talk to, we all hate officers, right? And what is the reason that enlisted soldiers hate officers? It's this uniform, it's this collective hatred of the officer class, right? I mean, in fact, during Vietnam, that was the thing in the main propaganda in the anti-war newspapers and things like that. And it's true today too. All enlisted people hate the officers. Well, why is that? They're the privileged ones. They're the ones who didn't have to join the army to go to college. They're the ones who went to college straight out of high school, got a scholarship, went to a good military academy or went to some Ivy League school, and then they come in to the military with all this privilege. They get the nicer house, they can afford a nicer car, they get all these extra benefits, they have their fancy officers club, they don't have to do the hard shit that all the enlisted people have to do. They're just kind of the managers that walk in and check everyone's uniform and tell people that they're screwing up or something, while the enlisted people are doing all of the work. It's almost like in a workplace, your manager who's kind of useless, and then all the workers that actually make the place run. And so, that is something that's immediately understood by everyone in the military. And they apply that to the politicians also. I mean, they don't if enlisted people don't even identify with their own low-ranking officers because of their privileged background and that the life that they have, how different it is from enlisted troops. We look at the politicians and those are the same exact thing. They're these rich, privileged people who went to nice schools, who are groomed for this political position. And you can't really identify with them. And then your life, especially when it comes to war, you're being sent to go on patrols where someone's going to get their leg blown off, or to go drive around pointlessly on some street where your vehicle is most likely going to get blown up, by these like rich, pampered people who don't have to deal with any of the repercussions. And it's just very easy for them to sit in their kind of nice, cushy life and make these decisions. And so I think, that's why I think Bernie Sanders appeals to so many soldiers, is because they don't see him as in that group of one of those rich, privileged people who's making callous decisions with their lives and doesn't really care what the outcome is. And so that's why, like, even if soldiers aren't expressly politically involved, they all are kind of in that precarious, like, class dynamic situation where they're kind of forced to confront these things when crises break out, like this Iran war situation.
Yeah, that's something we don't really hear about, is that difference in the military, because we always hear about the military as though it's essentially a single monolithic unit, as I was talking about. But, so much at this point, the U.S. military is so bloated, and it's so bloated with all these the quote unquote contractors, many of whom are different, essentially better described, I think, as mercenaries than contractors, but also the different weapons contractors and whatnot. Like the U.S. military is bloated and has so many of these elements within it, and has such a this kind of deranged approach to war, because essentially war is the only profitable commodity left within the U.S. in many ways. We haven't seen just how wrecked our economy is, because all of this money is this kind of all of this economy is being sort of artificially stimulated by this permanent wartime economy, and we don't see just how awful the real economy actually is if the U.S. ever had to withdraw from these infinite unwinnable wars abroad. But that, I think, has affected really the thinking of the Pentagon generals, the higher ups, to where some people, sure, Trump essentially made this kind of rogue decision in some ways to assassinate the one of the heads of state of a foreign government. That is an act of war. That was essentially rogue move. But at the same time, it must have had approval for somebody else. Trump himself didn't fire the missile. Trump didn't build the missile. So it seems like that class within the Pentagon of people, that class of these kind of deranged higher ups, honestly believes that war with Iran would be a good thing or would be a winnable thing. Like that there's some sort of institutional support that seems to be trying to propel the country in that direction, which of course would be absolute ruin for both our society and Iranian society and Iraqi society and much of the world.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's different reasons behind it. Like the Pentagon generals, of course, are the most like war driven, right? They come out of like the ideological training, these elite academies like West Point and the Citadel and these kind of elite military institutions that are the ones that churn out the people who end up being these high level Pentagon people. All of the instruction in these schools are like these types of scenarios. Like it's inevitable that we have to fight a war with China. It's inevitable that we have to fight a war with Russia. It's inevitable that we have to fight a war with Iran. And there's this, line of thinking that it's better to do it sooner rather than later. Because if it's going to be inevitable, we might as well do it while we're in the more dominant position than later when they're more prepared to fight the United States. And so it's this kind of uniform acceptance among them that these things are important for American world power and that we must do it for U.S. hegemony. It's in a pretty plain and kind of open way. But, there's even kind of like narrow interest, too. Like when the Iraq war was starting, all the officers were very, very happy and very, very excited. And that's because the way you get promoted as an officer is you have to have some kind of battlefield command. I mean, so until you're able to say, I commanded troops in battle, you're not really going to make it to the high echelons of the Pentagon and whatever your career aspirations are as an officer. And so that just leads to and of course, then it becomes like a self-fulfilling thing. Once you're a one-star general and you have influence over whether or not we go to war, if you were involved in that process, then you're going to become a two-star general. And then that just process goes on until you ultimately can become a four-star general and a chief at the Pentagon and all of this stuff. But there really are driven, these people, by just extremely narrow, like I believe we need to go to war and I want to be the one to do it because then I'm going to get another award. It's actually funny. Like when you're an officer and on a deployment, like you don't have to, every company commander, every captain and above, you just like automatically get a Bronze Star, which is an award for valor. And so if you're so like officers would just send their troops out to get shot at, and then they come back all shot up, and then the officer who wasn't there gets a Bronze Star. And then that goes on his promotion paperwork. He becomes a major and all of this stuff. And so it is really just like this kind of like fake like thing and like political thing internally for these people, while the enlisted, people like bear the brunt of it. And so the same thing is true with like getting us to our throne, right? Like Trump was presented all of these options for assassinating Soleimani and all this stuff by these types of high-ranking Pentagon people who really don't give a shit. It's good for them if a war starts on their watch. And then the more credentials and command they have while they're in, 95% of general grade officers, colonel and above, 95% of them or more, as soon as they retire from the military, they immediately go work for the defense industry, or they sit on a corporate board, or they're an advisor at one of these media things. And so they go out to very lucrative careers after they retire from their military service, I guess you could call it. And the more kind of under their belt that they have in terms of battle, war command experience, the more money they're going to make in the civilian world on these corporate boards and so forth. And all of them do it. It's like uniform. They all do this as the next step of their career.
It's absolutely deranged. It sounds like something out of the, like every time I kind of hear it described, everything I sort of learn about the military industrial complex, it sounds like sort of late stage Roman Empire. Like it's really
wild.
Yeah.
It's wild, but it's also just like so easy to see and easy for people to understand. And so that's why it's like they're so open about it, and it's eventually going to come back to bite them in a big way, the way that it's so clearly become. I mean, and it's not even just the Pentagon establishment, but even the political establishment of the military too, right? Like the Secretary of Defense, his last job was Vice President of Raytheon. Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense. I mean, even under the Obama administration, the guy, what's his name, Robert Gates, he was like on the corporate board of oil companies when he was like commanding the Iraq War. He actually served on the corporate board of the company that made the armored vehicles that were going to get blown up over and again in Afghanistan. And so it's plain for everyone to see, and it's up to people like us to be able to make these connections for people in the military who haven't made them themselves yet.
Absolutely. One of the reasons I wanted to do this particular segment is because we in our planning of a different anti-war on Iran protests here in Austin, we've been reached out to by quite a few veterans who either were with groups like Iraq Veterans Against a War. We've worked with About Face is another one.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of these different groups. Veterans for Peace is one of the older ones. So there are all these different like veterans anti-war groups who have kind of approached us and who have otherwise just kind of shown up to these different anti-war protests. And then the other part of that is I'm hearing from people who I know have family in the military basically saying that this whole thing is just bullshit, that the people they know in the military think it's bullshit. And so like I think it's really, really necessary for people to know that there are options. And if you have someone who in the military who's even questioning this stuff a little bit, that there are places to go for more information. So yeah, I'm wondering in our last couple of minutes, can you kind of go through like basically where people can go either to kind of direct different friends or family members, or if someone is in the military, where can they find more information?
Yeah, well, first of all, if you're a military family, there's a great organization called Military Families Speak Out. It's a great kind of large support network for anti-war family members of people in the military, even if your loved one in the military is not anti-war, right? I mean, it's still important to have that community. But if you're in the military, or if you know someone in the military, and if you don't, people who are listening, if you don't directly know someone in the military or a family member or a friend or something, you know someone who knows someone who's in the military. I mean, as we were talking about, the class composition of the U.S. military, it's our class that's in the military. And so we're only like 1 degree of separation from someone who is in right now. And so these are important. You should know the tools that you have at your disposal. And one of the best ones is the GI Rights Hotline. The number is easily Googleable. It's a 24/7 confidential hotline where they can give you all of your options for getting out of a deployment, getting out of the military. And they're not even, even if you go AWOL, like if you just walk off the base and you're on the run from the law, it's supposedly the way they like to characterize going AWOL, they can help you with that and how you can navigate that, where you come out best of all also. And so that resource is always there. Through the Eyes Left podcast, you can reach out to us on social media at Eyes Left Pod. And we've been counseling a lot of people since this. But I think that the thing people should know is that you do have rights and you do have options. And the military doesn't want you to know about these options. But they're there. They're on the books. They're in the Army regulations and Air Force regulations and Marine Corps regulations. They exist, and they don't want you to take advantage of those. One of the best ways, in my opinion, of course, if you have any medical things you can exploit, things like that. There's all these ways you can get medical discharges and whatever. Of course, you can always just go AWOL, and that's not that bad what they end up doing to you, except your discharge ends up, you may not retain all of your benefits, but if you're in a pinch, it's better than going to war and hurting someone or getting, killed or mutilated yourself. But the best option people have is conscientious objection. This is it's something you can get together in just a couple days, filling out the paperwork, writing an essay about why you're morally opposed to war. It's important to have help when you do that, like from the GI Rights Hotline or from someone like us. So you make sure to check all the boxes they need to see. But it's a really important tool because I've seen once you drop that paperwork to your commander, they have to honor the process and they have to take you off deployment status. So I've seen people a week out from deploying. They got all their bags packed and everything, and they drop this packet and they have to get taken off the deployment while it's being evaluated over a period of a couple months, however long the process takes. And so you have options. And, every conscientious objector packet I've worked with, which has been a few now, they've all gotten approved and everyone's gotten out with an honorable discharge. And the process hasn't taken very long. And so that's one of the best options. But of course, there's many other creative and legal ways that you can use. But it's just the main thing that's important for people to know is that you have them. And that there's no way they can make you go. They don't really have any power to make you go. And it's easier to see once you get out of the military. When you're in, it's just everything is regulated. If you oversleep, you're screwed. It's such a repressive, constant surveillance environment. But then when you kind of step outside, you realize that actually they don't have really any power over you. And there's really not much they can do to you. And so once you kind of take a step back and realize that you're the one with all the power, your situation changes dramatically.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to hear for sure. I think that's a great place to wrap up. We were joined by Mike Prysner, who's the co-host of Eyes Left podcast, as well as the producer of Empire Files with Abby Martin. Thank you very much, Mike, for coming on the show once again.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.